When news of the unexpected U.S.-Russia meeting broke, the geopolitical world paused not with relief, not with clarity, but with clashing emotions and rising tension. Because in a world already tiptoeing across a fragile line between diplomacy and disaster, a sudden handshake between adversaries doesn't always inspire peace. Sometimes it triggers recalculations, fear, and the need for immediate positioning, which is exactly what happened next as NATO within ours responded with an urgent, closed-door summit that sent a clear message to all parties involved. We are not asleep, and we are not sidelined. And that message rippled through every capital in Europe, where leaders found themselves unexpectedly racing to understand whether this meeting was a genuine diplomatic breakthrough or the beginning of something far more unpredictable. And in the middle of this tension sits the realist, voice of one of the world's most controversial yet accurate geopolitical thinkers, Professor John Mearsheimer, whose predictions over the last decade, once dismissed by mainstream analysts, are increasingly viewed as chillingly prescient, because Mearsheimer has been warning for years that Western intervention in what he argues is Russia's traditional sphere of influence would one day provoke a backlash so fierce, so wide, that it would spark not just regional consequences, but reconfigure global alliances in real time. And now that prophecy feels less academic and more active, as NATO scrambles behind the scenes to respond not just with words but with posture. Increases in Baltic surveillance, accelerated defense drills in Poland, new military advisories to member states bordering Russian airspace, and subtle reallocations of US forces already stationed in Europol performed not with theatrical bluster, but with the kind of eerie, procedural precision that only happens when decisions sense a strategic fog forming. And John Mearsheimer has long argued that when great powers engage with nuclear states over contested buffers, Ukraine or Georgia, the space for error shrinks dramatically. And what's making Europe so nervous now is the lack of transparency around what exactly was discussed in this U.S.-Russia meeting, with no joint press conference, no photo op, just an ambiguous release quoting shared concerns and common red lines, a phrase that leaves critics dissecting every syllable, because every word matters when hundreds of millions of lives depend on perception, deterrence, and signaling, especially in a moment where much of Europe still supports Ukraine publicly but is quietly exploring the economic costs of long-term military commitment. And into that vacuum, this surprise meeting blazed across newsrooms like wildfire. Russia is talking, the US is listening, and NATO is watching. And the question now is, what's being promised? What's at risk? And what happens if Europe is handed a new reality it didn't get to shape? And that uncomfortable dynamic echoes one of boldest critiques of US policy, that Washington underestimates the gravity of alliances earned versus alliances imposed. And if Russia and the US begin drawing boundaries of influence without full NATO coordination, then trust among European allies will erode faster than any treaty can repair. And that's what has leaders in Berlin, Warsaw, and Helsinki deeply alarmed. Because in Europe, proximity equals vulnerability. And if NATO feels isolated from US diplomatic maneuvers, the alliance starts to feel less like a shield and more like a guessing game. And that's not just dangerous, it's destabilizing, particularly at a time when domestic politics across Europe are growing more fragmented. Economies are under pressure, and confidence in traditional institutions is showing cracks. And Mearsheimer's realist thesis that nations act in self-interest first, under the illusion of idealism, second now has teeth. Because with one unannounced meeting, he believes the idea of Western unity was tested and possibly exposed. And while White House officials assure the public that coordination with NATO remains strong, military planners behind the scenes know better than to take diplomatic language at face value, especially when Russia's top envoy walked out of the meeting smiling. And sources close to NATO strategists are now confirming that new contingency. Plans are being drawn up, plans for troop movement, speed, capacity, signal jamming simulations, and force resilience exercises in case of miscommunication, a term that in the world of new powers carries terrifying implications. And what the public doesn't often see is how fast lines are redrawn when big players revisit their stakes. And if the U.S. is trying to negotiate a winding down of the Ukraine war or even opening slight concessions to avoid broader confrontation, it must walk a balance beam where Europe doesn't feel betrayed, while Russia doesn't feel emboldened, and that's the kind of diplomacy John Mearsheimer says the West was never emotionally prepared for, because strategy, not sentiment, rules geopolitics, and good strategy demands a long memory, short ego, and relentless clarity about limits. Because if NATO members interpret this meeting as the U.S. pre-negotiating independent terms with Moscow, we could start to see an inter-alliance cold front forming in the West itself. And that's not speculation, it's political physics. Because every alliance works until core interest gets redefined, and when that happens, survival instinct replaces protocol. And that instinct is now running high across Eastern Europe. As Poland pushes for more U.S. guarantees, the Baltic states increased radar operations, and even France's Macron calls for new European strategic sovereignty, a telling phrase that implies a future where Washington's leadership may no longer be absolute. And through this flurry of instability, Mearsheimer is not celebrating being right, but warning again. Buffer zones like Ukraine weren't just about ideology, they were about geography and age-old laws of power. And when those zones are breached, either by tanks or diplomacy, the entire chessboard shifts, not gradually but in bursts. And as NATO acts now react urgently, it signals one thing loud and clear. Nobody expected talks between adversaries to move this quickly. And that quickness is unsettling, because in international relations, speed often hides stakes. And for Europe, the fear isn't just about troop counts, it's about relevance. decision-making authority, and whether the continent still plays co-ed in its own defense, or whether it's a backdrop in a US-Russia reset that happens without full NATO fingerprints on every clause. And that's where podcast resonates the most. He doesn't argue from emotion. He argues from pattern, reminding viewers that great powers do not protect allies out of altruism, but out of interest, and when that interest shrinks, so does the support system. And now, in this moment of recalibration, Europe feels that shift not through headlines, but through whispers, canceled briefings, mysterious draft memos, and diplomats suddenly flying across capitals without leaving press schedules behind. And all those are signs of urgency hidden in diplomacy. And when that urgency reaches the grassroots among troops, citizens, local defense planners, you get tension rising across borders. You get whispers of new joint exercises, and fear that next time the announcement won't be about a meeting but about a movement, either of missiles, of troops, or of territory, on a map that's been redrawn too many times in history. Without Europe's consent, and if we want to avoid that, clarity must return fast, because in the storm of geopolitics, silence is not neutral, it's a message. And this message just hit all of Europe at once.